Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Darlene, Ernie, and Jen. This is Jill from DP Solutions. We're waiting for the password management webinar to get started. So while we wait, I put up a little quick fun poll about favorite Halloween candies. So feel free to pick what favorite Halloween candy you have. We'll go ahead and get started in a little bit.
Really appreciate it. Welcome everyone to the webinar this morning. This is a really important subject, password and login management. As you'll see as we go through today, there's been a lot of changes over the last few years in terms of where our data assets are located, how we access them, the complications with the number of accounts, logins we have to use, and then of course the actual management strategy. Someone said
you show your PowerPoint.
PowerPoint is not showing up. Thank you very much. All right, how does that look now? It's probably not a presentation. How does that look?
There we go. Perfect.
Great. Thanks, I appreciate that. Sometimes go to meetings a little weird with that stuff. Anyway, it's a really important subject, and so we're going to get into it right now. So we've had some pretty significant trends in computing in the last decade, and I'm basically saying, you know, through the 2010s, I guess you could call it. So, and this is just from my perspective, working in the managed IT services industry. So resources should really be available remotely and device agnostic. We've moved to an area where people really work anytime, anywhere. I believe the first iPhone was something like 2007. And I remember just myself, you know, I already had a BlackBerry, but when I got my iPhone, then the interest in doing more email remotely and doing more work remotely and having that anytime, any place stuff really became much more important. And of course, as these devices started coming into our lives, everything needed to be device agnostic. We wanted to work in a browser really on anything. So that's a real big shift, I think, that impacts this topic. Data theft is way up. Ransomware is on the rise, and there are more attacks on the user. Again, I don't think that this is surely be news to anybody, which is you're seeing a lot of these ransomware attacks that either take your data and they're trying to hold it hostage and get you to pay a ransom or put it out on maybe the dark web where people can exploit it and actually commit fraud or steal stuff from you. And there really are more attacks on the user now. If we can get into an account, we can take control of a computer based on something that a user does, that's really beneficial to a hacker. Technology is just getting way more decentralized. And with these cloud solutions, you see these black box products that you have to trust and outsource areas you used to manage locally. So it used to be, I remember I started in the MSP space in 2005, that everything had its server in-house. You had your database server for whatever application you had, your file server, your domain controller, your email server. It was all in-house and everything connected to that stuff for the most part. And now it's, well, you want email, you get Office 365 and you never see the server. So you can connect to it with anything. The file server might be located in a totally different place for a totally different provider. So essentially we've basically a la carted a lot of the things that we used to do locally. And then compliance has become broader and more stringent, probably for a good reason. I remember, again, like PCI and HIPAA have been around for a while in terms of the major compliance standards, but now you really see, you know, with government contractors having to meet CFARs. You also see it with this CMMC thing coming up, and GDPR in the EU, now the California privacy law. That there are more and more regulations and compliance standards. Now, granted, meeting them I don't think is a huge challenge if you take a good holistic view of it, but it has become more stringent and it's getting more and more organization. And so the bottom line is that traditional rules about login management don't really apply anymore. A simple password policy is really not enough for most organizations. It used to be that when we would set up a Active Directory environment, I'd say, okay, well, we're going to have 90-day password resets and password complexity, and we'll be good. You know, that's what we're going to do to keep our accounts secure. But I think the reality is that when you have things that are particularly sensitive, we just cannot count on these passwords and logins to be as suitable as they once were. So we need to do some stuff a little bit differently today. So today, here's our agenda. So we're going to go over the threat landscape. So where are we today? What are the actual threats, and why is there so much account level fraud? Everyone sees, just for example, just the other day, a friend of mine, I got a bunch of links on Facebook for click on this. It was obviously a virus. I get phishing emails all the time, or people doing, attacks from someone else's email, spoofing them, if you will. And why is that happening so much today? Where does this all come from? We're going to define where our security points need to be based on what is behind the login. So basically, like anything else, we're defining a security and risk management plan. The things we do really have to be based on what we care about. So we're really looking at what's behind the door, and then how do we reinforce the door once we know what's behind it. Multi-factor authentication, to be blunt, I don't really think is even an option. If you've been working with us in our managed services practice and you've attended quarterly business reviews, even now we're seeing with our new clients, we're pushing multi-factor authentication in a major way, at the very minimum on things like Office 365 on that side. The reason being it's a very significant risk reducer. So how can we deploy it effectively and without stress? I know in the past there's been a lot of bias against MFA because of the idea of hassle. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Password management tools, what should you know about them? There are a lot of tools out there. LastPass comes to mind. That's not an endorsement only of that product. There are a lot of tools. So what should you know about them, and how should you consider them in your life, both personally and professionally? Trusted devices and single sign-on, so security and convenience. Here at DP Solutions, we use this both to secure our stuff and also make it more convenient to log in. We utilize single sign-on and MFA to get into our email, our files, our Active Directory assets. It connects to my CRM, so on and so forth, which actually gave us the benefit both of securing our accounts a little bit more and making it so that those accounts are less likely to be broken into, but also making it a little bit easier to log in and have less barriers for entry. So we're in a good place now. As I said, there's a bias before about the inconvenience of multi-factor authentication, but I think now we're moving more towards, well, how can we get this multi-factor in place, but also make it more convenient so it's sort of a win-win? So we're going to talk about that. And then just some general tips and your Q&A. So here are a few statistics about the threat landscape. So in 2016, we had a breach of 3 million Yahoo accounts. And I would, in 2016, and I would ask any of those 3 billion people, maybe some of them are on this call, did you use that information elsewhere? Because if so, that information is probably out on the dark web and it's used against you outside of Yahoo. They see, oh, Ben Schmerler had a Yahoo account and this was his password on Yahoo, so I'm going to try that on Gmail, and I'm going to try this on Bank of America or whatever other accounts, because maybe Ben isn't savvy enough to change his passwords in other places. So basically the information is out there, and insecure passwords are basically a time bomb to get hacked. In 2017, 5.4 billion WannaCry virus attacks were blocked. So why am I bringing up the idea of blocked attacks when it comes to WannaCry? I'm sure many people have heard about WannaCry and the impact it can have. Obviously, it impacted a lot of municipalities and locked up computers. But you can see we're blocking a ton of attacks. 5.4 billion is not an insignificant number, and yet these things still get through. And so I think the important thing is that our technical tools are really, really good in terms of blocking these threats, but they still get through, and it's because a lot of times these attacks go around things that make our networks more secure. If they get into your account and they deploy it manually, if you allow someone in, it doesn't matter what services you have set up. If you disable something, it doesn't matter what services you set up. The most expensive component of a cyber attack is information loss at 43%. So I could probably come up with all the statistics regarding this, but the truth is that I said this before, the computers and switches and firewalls and servers big capital expense they made to purchase these products or the monthly fees they pay to manage these products. But really, the more valuable component, the reason we use it in the first place, is the data. So we need to look at the value of the asset behind the technology and then match our security to it. 60% of malicious domain names are affiliated with spam and phishing attacks. So that's a pretty big one. And follow-up stats, 20% are very new domains and used immediately. So one question I get a lot is, why do so many phishing attacks get through spam filters? Well, this is one reason why. Spam filters blacklist based on known information about spammers, criminals, etc. And if I create a new domain name today and I start using it for spam, it's easier for it to break through a spam filter than it is for an established domain that has been known to not create spam, or something that's been used for an attack before, where the blacklists are educated enough to stop that stuff. Not just that, but domains are very cheap. So you just buy domains constantly and commit crimes with them and get away with it. This is all going after people. 61% of breach victims in 2017 were businesses with under 1,000 employees. We hear about Equifax or Target or some of these other big breaches, and we think about big organizations that have a lot to lose when it comes to data loss. But you can see more than half of these breaches were what we would probably consider small, medium-sized businesses. And I have a follow-up stat here. 65% of companies over 500 users are never prompted to change their password. That's kind of a scary thought, right? That these big, powerful companies that have all these resources don't even have an effective password management strategy. So that doesn't really surprise me. I go to a lot of places for the first time, and I see a lot of stuff that is a little bit alarming when we go and prospect for a potential new client. So just because we have a lot of expensive technology out there in small businesses, big businesses, government, et cetera, doesn't mean that stuff's managed well. 1 in 13 web requests lead to malware, according to Symantec. So this just goes, it's basically, the fact is that I've used the analogy that we're walking through a minefield when we go on the web, or we're swimming with the sharks, so to speak. We're going out to the internet to do our shopping and our online banking and stuff like that. And yet there's a pretty good chance that if we submit a web request, that some sort of result on that will lead to ransomware or malware or something like that. So why is there so much focus on attacking accounts? So first reason is that people are an easier target. So the truth is that a well-maintained machine is hard to break into. If WannaCry or another piece of ransomware is targeting a specific exploit, and that exploit has been patched through because it's been maintained, it's really hard to execute an attack using that tool in terms of a brute force attack. But if I get someone to voluntarily let me into their computer, or someone to permit an application to run, or permit the antivirus application to stop running, or whatever they do, then the technology itself doesn't matter. And so really the people are an easier target. I sort of mentioned this before in the statistics, but poor management of login. There's any number of reasons why this occurs, but I think some of it is the idea sometimes that it can be sometimes that people of privilege within organizations will be reluctant to have a stringent password policy because they find it inconvenient, or they don't want to deal with it. Sometimes it's they think the financial cost of implementing a strong MFA policy is not worth it, when in fact it's probably the best ROI that you could make in terms of security. There's any number of reasons, but the truth is that when I go in and I do audits of clients that I'm not supporting currently, I find a lot of bad login policies, and I just think it's something that people haven't focused on as much as they could. The data is valuable, right? I mean, they know that you'll pay the ransom if your operation is down, or it can be sold. We can go on the dark web, make a quick buck selling that information. So let's go after the accounts. Let's go after the data. It's a nice little payoff, and it's cheap to do the attack. which is my next point. It's sort of very easy. It's cheap and easy to cover up. One consequence of the blockchain currencies like Bitcoin or the cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin is these things are hard to trace. And so once you transfer that Bitcoin for a ransomware attack to a bad guy, they're just going to get away with it. I mean, there's no way for the authorities to really catch up with these criminals, and the money is basically laundered at that point. And especially if the attack's coming from another continent. I mean, there's just no way to stop this stuff. Unlike a bank robbery, where I'm not a bank robber, and perhaps I don't know the statistics on it, but I would imagine that if you went up to a Bank of America branch and you decided you're going to rob it, you'd probably not get away with it too easily, unlike a cyber attack. And as I mentioned before, it's easier than breaking into well-maintained devices. So going after accounts, going after users, I can have a very secure PC, and I can go on portal.office.com and go into someone's and try and find an admin account for someone's 365, and eventually probably break into that account if it's not well managed, even if the device itself is maintained. The account side is an open book. It's a portal that is open for access. Which brings me to coming up with a good sensitive data policy and assessment. So ultimately, if we're going to achieve good login management, good security, we have to do that. And one thing I did mention in my statistics is that cybersecurity expenses are going up. It's appropriate because our use of technology is getting more significant. We're relying on technology more to operate our business. It's now part of our production as opposed to a simple expense. I have to buy all these people PCs. Now I need these PCs to be able to do my job, and how they perform and how they are secured is going to be a part of my productivity. If I can't keep my stuff secured and maintained, if my operating systems or my computers aren't fast and stuff like that, we're going to have business problems. But since those cybersecurity expenses are going up, we need to make sure that the investments we make are effective. And we can't really do that unless we really have a good policy and sensitive data assessment. So before establishing any security, we should do a number of things. First, we need to identify what compliance standards we may need to meet based on the data you use. So depending on what my organization does, what kind of data we have, we're going to be subject to any number of compliance standards. And what I would also say, of course, is that if we're not sure, then a good approach is to say, well, these are the things we care about as an organization. These are the things that we think, if they got out there, would be bad for us or bad for our clients or our partners. And as such, we're going to develop a framework for security that we think addresses this stuff. And of course, you would do this with an expert I would recommend, such as DP Solutions, where we can come up with a good cybersecurity policy and strategy. But the point is that if you don't identify what standards you may need to meet, then we can't really come up with an effective security plan. You need to specifically state in an organizational policy what data you interact with that you're liable for protecting. So a lot of times there's ignorance when users go to share information or back up information or hold information in clouds or on their local desktop, because we really haven't specified to them that these are the pieces of data that we care about and this is where they belong. We sort of assume that people are going to be good data stakeholders, but we don't really communicate with them often. And I find that when that communication is lacking in terms of organizationally where data goes and how it's managed, that comes out in terms of how people work and the security ramifications. The management team should fundamentally understand the value of the data that's out there should it be lost or stolen. So we need to be able to actually put on paper material losses or whatever that occur when data is lost. Well, I have credit card data for my 10,000 clients, and if that data is lost or stolen, I'm going to have fines that I have to deal with. I'm going to get audited by PCI. We're going to lose clients, and that's going to cost us this much in revenue this year, on and on and on. And we should list out all of those costs. And that's really what the value of the data is. And if we can identify that, then we can determine what kind of security investments we make to get a good return of investment on risk management. So let me move on real quick. There we go. There should be a match between what technology you use and where the data sits, right? So I think a lot of times when we do this stuff, we hear a buzzword. You know, I mentioned multi-factor authentication up front, and I said that multi-factor is a really important thing for data management, but maybe it's not right for you. There needs to be a match between what technology you use and where that data sits. If I do everything remotely, like I have all of my staff all over the country and they all remote into, say, a server I host with Microsoft Azure that has maybe a terminal server access or a Citrix type access or something like that, then that multi-factor authentication is even more important. And that's a strong match between your risk factors and where your data sits and the way you work. It would be harder to make that case if that information wasn't accessible outside an office, right? It's hard to implement a multi-factor authentication solution when everything is physically locked to a building. For some reason, my broadcast just, there we go. Sorry about that. So first question we would want to ask really is what applications actually host this data, okay? So when we defined in the previous slide what data we have and what we care about, how valuable it is, now we have to say, well, where does this data actually sit? I said applications, we could also say file servers, et cetera, but where does this actual data sit in the end? Those are our vaults, if you will, and those are the vaults we need to protect. How do you share it with others? Do you send these things via email? Do you send a secure link? Do you not share it at all? Is it forbidden to be shared? We need to ask those questions, and really it's more about what do we need to do to be productive first, and then based on how we need to be productive, building a security policy around that before we start designing and implementing technology. Where do you access this data? So are you accessing this data from your home, from your office? You travel around the country and you're going to access it from, say, airports or hotels. Are you going to use a mobile hotspot to connect to your data assets? Are you going to need to use third-party computers, perhaps a kiosk in someone's office or a hotel or something like that? That's also going to impact what tools we use and what security we use. From what devices? So I can't implement a security policy for something that won't work on someone's iPhone. You know, everybody uses iPhones. If we have a security policy that speaks to something that on a device that doesn't support that device, then we're obviously making a huge mistake. And then fundamentally, we should be able to create a workflow that speaks to how sensitive data is touched. You know, this is less technology and more about how we operate. When sensitive data comes in, it goes to this people or this department or something like that. Then it flows to this department. It goes into this system. It goes out to this third party. Whatever that flow is, you should be able to outline that, define it in policy, and then be able to build the tech around it. But I, as a technology guy, I can't be the one who defines what that workflow is. I don't work in your company on a regular basis. I couldn't tell you exactly how that works. If you can define for me how that stuff flows and what you care about, then again, I can use my expertise as a technologist to sort of come up with the right solution. So one of the most effective tools in limiting account breach is multi-factor authentication. So as defined, and you can kind of see it a little bit with the graphic, it's an extra method of independent authentication besides the username and password. So it's a token, text message, third-party application. You know, we're a big partner with a company called Duo. Duo has an application that gives you, you press an authorize button and you're able to connect to an account. A number of tools, you know, Office 365 works this way, offer text messages, SMS messages to be able to send a token when you're logging in from a new device or a untrusted device or from the web. There's also the little keys, the little things with the tiny LCDs on them that will have a constantly changing digit on them. That's another way of multi-factor authentication. Sometimes you even have cards that you can slip into a computer, again, to a slot, and that's your extra level of access. So there are a lot of advantages to doing this. Username and password is great, but any password over time can be cracked. So a hacker without a token will have a much harder time. I'm not going to sit here and say that having multi-factor authentication is somehow a panacea of stopping all sorts of fraudulent access to your account. However, getting a username and password, breaking that, and then spoofing, say, a SIM card that would go in your phone so that you would get that text message is a much more complicated attack than just breaking a password. And I'm not saying it can't be done. It absolutely can be done. But bad guys look for the low-hanging fruit. And so that means they're going to be looking at the accounts that aren't utilizing multi-factor authentication, that have the weak passwords in place. And that's the same thing goes, by the way, for other things. Like, for example, we're approaching end of life with Windows 7 and Server 2008. So I'd encourage everyone on this call to make sure you address that. But in January, expect the people who are attacking or targeting organizations to look for nodes that run those operating systems, because they know they're going to be less maintained and have more vulnerabilities that Microsoft isn't taking care of. So we want to make sure that we're putting up a strong defense that we're not even a target. This tool can reduce the need for constant password resets and complex passwords and password management tools and all that stuff. If I'm using single sign-on especially, and I have multi-factor authentication in place, I might not care if you don't have a 30-character alphanumeric with punctuation password, because even if that initial password is broken, it's hard to have that token. And so it makes just the need to manage passwords a lot simpler. I mentioned before, it can be paired with single sign-on to control multiple potential authentication points. They use the example of DP Solutions. When I log into my PC and authenticate with multi-factor authentication, it gets me into a number of other systems behind the scenes once I link those accounts together. That's a really great benefit of having this tool. It's actually made my life a little easier and made us more secure. So I'm really, really happy with it. You can't always do that. Sometimes there's issues making single sign-on work, but oftentimes you can, and it's something we always try and explore. Sends a message to all staff that what they're doing is sensitive. So I think this is actually also an important thing, is that there's sort of a cultural message behind this, is that, hey, we're making you do this extra factor because what's behind the door is really important. And so now that we've given you in, now that we've let you in the club, so to speak, you need to be careful. We put a lot of barriers to get you in. So now you have to have some mindfulness about what you're doing when you're working in this environment. So I think that's kind of an important benefit here. I'm going to pivot a little bit to password management tools. So looking a little bit broader, we probably can't use multi-factor authentication everywhere. And I imagine a number of people on the line are asking, well, what about my Facebook account? What about my online banking accounts, or perhaps my Amazon account, or whatever, these different things that we use, and I just can't remember all this stuff. Well, password management tools can really help with that. And just to give you a sense, a password management tool is basically a database of passwords, and they have another level of security, hopefully, behind that. And the idea is that it makes it so that you don't have to spend as much time and stress writing down passwords, which you should not really do that much, or coming up with resets and all that stuff. So some advantages of these tools. A lot of the times they can generate complex passwords without having you having to do the guesswork, right? I can go into a lot of these products, not always, but some of these products, and say, you know what, I don't want to think about my Facebook password. Just tell me what a good Facebook password is. It generates it, it saves it, it locks it behind that primary account, which often has multi-factor authentication behind it, so that your database of passwords is locked. And you didn't have to think about whether that was a good password or not. It used the formula to come up with one. As I mentioned before, it stores the passwords for you, often allows automatic browser filling and stuff like that. So that can be very nice and save a little time. Same with login forms. So let's say there are other parts of login forms. Oftentimes the password management tools streamline the whole process. That can be kind of nice. They can also be an effective defense against phishing. If you are getting a password generated by a third party, and then you get a phishing email, and that phishing email has a fake link to a fake Amazon page, and it's Amazon, and they're saying, hey, we see some suspicious activity on your account. Log in here to check your settings or whatever, which is often a phishing exercise. You click that link. Well, the password manager will not fill in that form because it's not a real Amazon site. The password manager knows what Amazon site is, and it will not do a lot of that auto-filling stuff. So even though you technically sort of fell for the phishing scheme by clicking that link, oftentimes you kind of get blocked at the point of entry because the password manager is passively telling you, hey, this isn't right. This isn't Amazon site. This is somebody else. So a lot of people don't think about that, but it's a big benefit to using these products. But I want to bring up some challenges, though. Password management tools are not perfect, and we need to manage these things right and manage our expectations. So one is controlling that central login. If I have a lousy password password and no multi-factor authentication, I'm using a password manager. Well, then now I've given the criminals the keys to the entire castle. So we really need to focus on that central login and make sure that that part is secure. Research is very, very important. So this applies not just to password management tools, but to these personal VPNs you see all the time. We need to trust this vendor a lot. I'm not terribly worried when we contract with Microsoft to do hosting in Azure or Office 365. I'm not really worried about using other trusted vendors with big companies and trusting them with our data because they're audited, they have guarantees in their agreements, so on and so forth. But I think with these personal VPNs, password managers, the tools are so broad and there's so many out there, and not a lot of people know these companies by name as well. It's not a Microsoft or an Amazon or something like that. So it's really important that we know who we're actually giving this information to. It's getting even more complicated given geopolitical concerns. What if a VPN company has a Chinese ownership or something like that, and there's a tie to the state government? Well, now we're getting into a little bit more complicated questions. Am I giving sensitive information to a company that may have something beholden to a foreign government? So we need to really be careful before we just start trusting this stuff. And this is going to become a increasing challenge, not just now, but into the future as these lines get a little bit more muddy. The free tools can be useful, but the more complex tools can have broader feature sets. So I don't think this is really a shock here. Things that are free are kind of often very useful. I know a lot of people get a lot of benefits from things like free antivirus on personal computers, or the core Authy app for multi-factor authentication, managing those tokens is very useful. As it may not surprise you, usually once you have a little skin in the game and you spend a little money on it, you tend to get more to it. Some of those login forms, the password generation stuff, and usually some other bolt-on security tools. Local password managers can be more secure but more limited. So what do I mean by that? So we could have a browser-based or account-based password manager, and then the point of entry is on the account side. That is really good for convenience, but it brings the question, well, what happens at that point of entry? Now, if I have the password manager locally on the device and that device is really well secured, that password manager can be more secure, but the truth is that those local password management tools generally are very feature limited. So I personally am not a huge fan of local password managers. I believe in having those web-based tools, but just really locking them down at the web at the authentication point. But that's just the consideration. And I would say that this goes, this discussion is going to be just the base of where you go when you're looking at password management tools for you. And the answer might not be the same for everybody. And this can still be poorly managed, right? If I am asleep at the wheel when it comes to how I manage my password manager, then it doesn't really matter. It's going to be very important when you implement a password management tool, especially these non-local ones, to manage and maintain your browsers. So if I'm filling in information automatically from a password manager, but something is scraping data from a browser because I'm not patching up my Google Chrome or my Windows Edge or whatever, my browser, then it doesn't matter that my passwords are secure. Someone's scraping that data and using it against me. So we really have to make sure we maintain browsers. And oftentimes when I do vulnerability tests, I find things like Firefox, Google Chrome, browsers do not get the patches that maybe Windows get. I'm going to pivot real quick to the concept of trusted devices and single sign-on. This is another tool in your belt when it comes to login management. So the goal is to simplify the login process by minimizing points of entry. So if you look at this, this is something like what we use here. You can see the little checkbox here. I sign in frequently on this device. Don't ask me for a code. You know, I didn't have to, when I configured my Outlook on my device, every time I log in to check my mail, I don't have to go in and enter a code every time. It trusts the device. It trusts the thing implicitly. So I don't have to do this every time, but I have to check that little box. This is really useful. Some applications have interfaces with other authenticating applications. So you can see that down there it says login with single sign-on. You enter a user. There's a option for a username and password, and so maybe that's just a core login for that tool. But it may be that it links with something else. So, for example, there are a lot of applications. I think I use this for the New York Times when I read the paper. I log in to the New York Times, not through the New York Times login, but through my Google login for my personal Gmail account. And that's really nice because now I could just use a really secure Gmail password and authentication through there, and now that covers the New York Times. And I just click the little, log me in with Google, and that makes it much easier. So you can interface with an Active Directory server too. So like if you have Windows Active Directory, like most businesses should, you can oftentimes interface applications directly with Active Directory. And you can make sign-in automatic. So for example, with ConnectWise, which is our CRM here, I don't even have to log into ConnectWise anymore. Once I did the SSO with ConnectWise, I connected. Now I open ConnectWise, and I just see the wheels spinning while it connects me to the application. Before we get to Q&A, let's do a few tips. MFA and other tools help reduce the risk of successful phishing attacks. Not a guarantee. We still need to have security training. MFA is a big reducer, though, because even if someone gets a hold of your username and password, MFA won't give them that token. Only you have that token, and it's going to make things a lot harder, even if they trick you on the phishing side. Good authentication management requires good user management. So when a staff member leaves, I can set up a very secure username and password policy, give that user MFA, then that user resigns or quits or gets fired or whatever, and then we don't deal with removing that user, or you didn't communicate with your IT provider that that person was let go. Well, now that person still has access to the system, and if you're not communicating that stuff, we can't help you. We need to know what people have access to when they log in. So outside of all these tools, we shouldn't be giving people access to things they don't need. If people don't need to install applications or run executables or access specific types of files or whatever, we should be utilizing what HIPAA would call the minimum necessary standard, which is just that people should have access to what they need and nothing else. If an account is exploited, which is always going to be possible, we want to limit our exposure whenever possible. Don't pick easy security questions. So we all get those things when we log in and say, well, verify your identity, and it asks you a question, and you say, oh, I know this one is, what's my street address name or something like that. Well, that's an easy security question. You need to pick things that are a little more complicated. Ask yourself, who else knows the answer to this security question? Is this something in the public record? Is this something that a lot of people know about me? Or is it something that only I will know? One I like is something like the name of my first pet, or something that's very obscure, something that really only you will know, that is intimate and close to you, but not something that the general public would really know about. I guess that's getting harder given what we share on social media. Don't log into sensitive systems using kiosks. I mentioned the idea, well, what if you use a kiosk to work? I mean, maybe there are real reasons that this needs to be done. I think in the age where laptop computers and mobile devices are fairly inexpensive, relatively speaking, we should really try and avoid using those kiosks for sensitive work. It's just not that necessary, and I think the risk is too great. Password lists are very dangerous, and it's better to just reset it. So I know there's this worry that I hear a lot, which is, well, what if somebody leaves and I can't get into their account? Well, we can reset their account. There's a lot of things we can do. We shouldn't put ourselves in a situation where we're so leveraged that we feel that we have to have someone's password available to get into their account. I mean, it's bad governance of users. It creates a difficult audit trail should something happen with the account. I would rather us take the time to reset an account and get back in with a fresh, clean, secure slate than keeping a locked box with all the keys to the castle in it. I just think that's not good policy. So we're going to take some questions now, but while you guys put anything together, I wanted to talk about a couple of our upcoming webinars, especially because, with the holidays coming up, normally it's the last Wednesday of every month, but we're making some changes in light of Thanksgiving and Christmas. I assume that on December 25th, when you're opening presents, you don't want to hear me talk about security. So on November 26th, which is a Tuesday, I believe, we're going to talk about some cybersecurity tips for Thanksgiving weekend. We're putting together some of those details now, but it's going to be a lot about, we're approaching Black Friday and Cyber Monday. There's a lot of charity going on and things like that. Well, let's talk about the next month where all this commerce activity occurs on the web, and what can we do to make things more secure for you, a little bit on an individual basis. But these things can also apply to your business. And then in December, on December 18th, which is the Wednesday before Christmas, we're going to talk 2020 tech trends and planning. We did something similar last year where we talked about 2019 investments to come. I think we're going to sort of broaden that a little bit and talk more about trends that we see, planning for the next year, things to look out for, and stuff like that. We had a real positive response from that last year, and we're going to revisit it. And with that, I'll ask Jill. Jill, did we get any questions in?
Yes, we did. And just as a reminder, go ahead and fill out the question box, and we'll read your questions, and Ben will answer them. So we did have one come in. Are password managers safe, and what happens if the password manager is hacked? Kind of a two-part.
Yeah, I mean, so the answer is, are password managers safe, and what happens next? So on a sort of meta level, are password managers safe? And the answer is, for the most part, it's all relative, right? LastPass, just to give an example, is more safe than keeping a binder full of passwords in it. What is safe, right? Safe is a relative thing. Anything can be hacked, and even though I have some trust in LastPass, I don't take it for granted. So I think real safety is saying, well, this is what I use, but this is my plan if something goes wrong. So just to use LastPass as an example, when I'm setting up all those passwords in LastPass and login, I should really know what's going in there and understand, well, if something goes wrong with LastPass, what are my options? What can I do with the company? What can I do to export that stuff out or close my account or do whatever? A lot of this also, we didn't talk about this, but when something's exploited, it really should be your policy personally to speaking of Windows. Oh no. I think I'm about to get signed out on Windows by Rashid's rebootage. But anyway, when you're creating when you have a breach on an account, that's a good time to reset all of your passwords. You don't want to have a situation where something bad happens and now you don't know what's exposed. let's take the conservative approach, change everything up. There goes my PowerPoint. I'm so sorry. My machine literally rebooted from an update in the middle of the webinar. But we got to the slide deck. So that's one approach. I apologize for that rambling answer. Jill, could we move to the next one?
Yeah, that's fine. No problem. And I'm actually still seeing your last slide. So
that's weird. Okay.
All right, we had one more question come in. What does it mean when I get notified of a suspicious login attempt, and what should I do about it?
What should I do when I get a notification of suspicious login attempt, and what should I do about it? So first, be skeptical. So this is a potential phishing attack. It could be good, it could not be good, right? One side of this could be that this is bait to get you to log in and give your information. I would be very skeptical if it was, you have a suspicious thing, please click here to learn more. Because oftentimes they're going to try and get you to log into your account. What those messages really should say is, we've blocked your account. Please contact us at this number, or something like that, to give you a secure way of getting back to a new login. But I would be very, very skeptical. Yeah, I would look and make sure that it's the domain name associated with the account that I'm actually concerned about. I would hover over the link to make sure that it actually links back to that site. It doesn't link to some, weird, 200-character URL. I would do all of the above and approach it that way. But I would be extremely skeptical. If this is something for like a work account, I would absolutely contact IT support right away. If you're working with us, I would contact DPS service desk. We can help guide you through it. I recommend not forwarding the email, maybe taking a screenshot of it or taking a picture with your phone and sharing it with somebody that you trust who can then help you determine what's going on. But this is a potential point of either success or failure when it comes to security. And I advise skepticism first, and then go through, change all of those passwords for accounts that may have been compromised if you're concerned about it. Take an aggressive, conservative approach to dealing with the potential issue, but don't trust the messenger necessarily. So I know that's kind of another sort of muddied answer, but you have to show a little bit of judgment and then not be afraid to ask if you need help.
Okay, excellent. Well, it looks like that's all the questions that we have, actually. But I know, guys, we're going to be sending out like I said, that we're going to be sending out the recording later today. Ben's email's there if you need to ask a question, if you think of something else.
Yes. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for attending. I really appreciate it.